The wind didn't just howl, it screamed like a dying animal, tearing through the jagged ice of Street Lawrence Island, with enough force to rip a man from his feet. The temperature had plummeted to 40 below zero, freezing the blood on Chief Petty Officer Caleb Hayes' tactical gloves. Beside him, Kaiser, a 100-pound Navy SEAL-trained German shepherd, pressed his trembling, ice-caked body against Caleb's thigh, his ears pinned back against the gale, staring into the gutted, bullet-riddled fuselage of the downed aircraft. Engulfed in a terrifying whiteout, Caleb leaned close to his radio man. "Are they still alive?" The Navy SEAL whispered in the middle of the storm. The only answer was the deafening roar of the blizzard and a low, guttural growl vibrating in Kaiser's throat. They were not alone. The mission briefing aboard the USS Anchorage, stationed 200 miles south of the Bering Strait, had been rushed and sanitized. Too sanitized. Captain David Reynolds had stood before SEAL Team 6's Alpha Squad, with a grin set to his jaw, tapping a satellite image on the digital whiteboard. A civilian contracted Gulfstream G650, supposedly surveying maritime routes, had gone off the radar near an uninhabited spit of rock off the Alaskan coast. The official line was a catastrophic mechanical failure due to an unpredicted low-pressure system. But Caleb Hayes, a veteran with 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in the Horn of Africa, knew better. You didn't scramble Tier 1 operators with a multi-purpose canine for a simple search and rescue. The true objective was the high-value asset on board. Dr. Arthur Caldwell, a former DARPA engineer specializing in autonomous weapons systems. Caldwell was off the grid, and someone had brought his plane down. "Wheels up in 10, Reynolds had said, his voice cutting through the tension in the briefing room. "The weather is deteriorating faster than NOAA predicted. You have a 4-hour window before this storm becomes a Category 5 hurricane wrapped in a blizzard. Find Caldwell. Secure the drive. Burn the rest. Now." Hovering 50 feet above the churning black water of the Bering Sea, that 4-hour window felt like a sick joke. The MH-60 Black Hawk was violently pitching side to side. The pilots, seasoned night stalkers from the 160th SOAR, were fighting a losing battle against 90-knot crosswinds. "1 minute," shouted Elias Finnegan, the squad's heavy weapons specialist, his voice barely audible over the screaming turbines in the storm. He was clinging to the starboard bulkhead, his face obscured by a neoprene mask and panoramic night vision goggles. Caleb checked his gear for the 4th time. MK-18 assault rifle, suppressed. Plate carrier tight. 7 magazines. IFAK medkit. Next to him, Kaiser sat with unnatural stillness. The German Shepherd was an elite operator in his own right, equipped with a K9 tactical vest, specialized goggles to protect his eyes from ice shards, and booties that shielded his paws from the freezing terrain. Kaiser's head was raised, his nose sampling the frigid air rushing through the open helo doors. The dog had a confirmed operational history that would put most infantrymen to shame, trained to detect explosives, track human scents miles away, and take down hostile combatants with bone-crushing force. "Target zone is a mess, Chief," yelled Wyatt Sullivan, the team's medic and radio man tapping the side of his helmet. "Comm signals are degrading. The magnetic interference from the storm is scrambling the SATCOM. We go regardless," Caleb barked back. He unclipped Kaiser's tether from the deck ring and secured the dog's quick-release harness to his own chest rig for the tandem fast-rope descent. Kaiser didn't flinch. The dog simply licked his chops and braced his paws against the deck. Suddenly, a massive downdraft hit the Black Hawk. The helicopter dropped 50 feet in a second. The sudden loss of altitude, slamming the men against their restraints. The airframe groaned under the immense torsional stress. A red warning light flashed furiously in the cabin. "Engine torque at critical. We can't hold the hover." The pilot's voice crackled frantically over the comms. "You have to go now, Chief, or I'm taking us back. Go, go, go." Caleb roared. Finnegan went first, grabbing the thick, braided fast rope and sliding into the black void. Sullivan followed a second later. Caleb stepped to the edge, the weight of Kaiser pulling tightly against his chest. The wind outside the fuselage was a physical wall, hitting him with the force of a speeding truck. He gripped the rope, locked his boots, and dropped. The descent was a blur of freezing rain and violent wind. The rope swung wildly, threatening to slam them into the jagged sea stacks, rising from the water like broken teeth. Caleb hit the icy, uneven rock of the shoreline hard, his knees absorbing the shock. He immediately hit the quick release, detaching Kaiser. The shepherd landed gracefully on all fours, instantly shaking the ice from his coat and taking a defensive posture, scanning the darkness. Above them, the Black Hawk didn't wait. The pilot throttled up, banking sharply to avoid a sheer cliff face, and vanished into the swirling white maelstrom. The roar of the rotors faded, replaced instantly by the overwhelming, deafening howl of the Arctic cyclone. Caleb tapped his night vision goggles down. The world turned into a grainy, emerald-green nightmare. Snow was falling so horizontally, it looked like tracer fire. "Rally up! Comm check!" Caleb shouted over the squad radio, crouching behind a boulder to escape the worst of the wind. "Finnegan, good," came the crackly reply. "Sullivan, I'm up. My ankle took a weird roll, but I'm functional." Caleb moved to Sullivan, doing a quick, tactile check of the medic's leg. Sullivan winced, but gave a thumbs up. "We're 3 miles south of the crash coordinates," Caleb said, checking his wrist-mounted GPS, though the signal was flashing weakly. "The storm pushed our drop zone. We have to hump it over this ridge. Stay tight. If you lose sight of the man in front of you, you're dead." Kaiser let out a sharp, low woof, pressing his nose against the snow. "Track, Kaiser," Caleb commanded. The dog lowered his head and began to lead the way into the blinding white. The hunt had begun, but Caleb couldn't shake the creeping dread in his stomach. The storm was bad, but the silence on the airwaves was worse. The trek across the coastal ridge took 2 agonizing hours. The temperature continued to plummet, freezing the condensation from their breaths onto their masks. Every step was a battle against the elements. The wind constantly tried to push them off the sheer cliffs to their right, where the black ocean boiled violently against the rocks below. Kaiser led the formation, his head down, navigating entirely by scent and a specialized instinct forged in the fires of Coronado's training grounds. The dog would occasionally stop, wait for the 3 humans to catch up, and then push forward through the snowdrifts that were already waist-deep in places. "Chief, I'm losing feeling in my left hand," Sullivan reported over the comms. His voice was strained. The medic was a tough kid from South Boston, but the Arctic didn't care about toughness. Frostbite was a ticking clock. "Keep moving your fingers, Sully. Do not stop," Caleb replied, his own legs burning with lactic acid. "We're less than half a mile out." They crested a jagged, ice-covered rise, and suddenly, the storm seemed to break for a fraction of a second, offering a momentary window of visibility. Down in a shallow ravine, partially buried under a rapidly growing snowdrift, lay the remains of the Gulf Stream. It was a scene of utter devastation. The aircraft had been cleaved in 2. The tail section was resting precariously on a rocky outcropping, while the main fuselage and cockpit had plowed deep into the frozen earth. A massive trail of scarred rock and shredded metal marked its tragic path. "There it is," Finnegan muttered, racking the charging handle of his MK-48 machine gun. "Doesn't look like anyone walked away from that. We clear it systematically. Finn, take the high ground on the ridge. Cover our approach. Sully, with me," Caleb ordered. As Caleb and Sullivan approached the main wreckage, Kaiser's behavior changed drastically. The dog stopped pulling on his lead. His ears pricked straight up, swiveling like radar dishes. The fur along his spine bristled, and he let out a sound Caleb had only heard a handful of times, a deep, resonant, vibrating growl that signaled imminent danger. "Hold up," Caleb signaled, dropping to one knee and raising his rifle. He scanned the perimeter through his thermal optics. Nothing but the swirling blue-white of the freezing snow. But he trusted Kaiser more than he trusted million-dollar technology. "Kaiser, what is it?" The dog didn't move forward to track. Instead, he stepped laterally, placing himself directly in front of Caleb, a physical barrier between his handler and the aircraft. "Sully, keep your eyes peeled. The dog smells something wrong," Caleb whispered over the short-range comms. They moved methodically to the torn-open rear of the fuselage. The wind was funneling through the metal tube, creating a haunting, whistling sound. Caleb clicked on his weapon light, piercing the gloom inside the cabin. The interior was a nightmare. Luxury leather seats were ripped from their moorings. Emergency oxygen masks dangled like dead snakes from the ceiling. There was blood. A lot of it. It was splashed across the pristine white bulkheads, already freezing into dark crimson ice. Caleb and Sullivan stepped inside, the metal groaning under their boots. They found the pilot and the co-pilot in the cockpit. The impact had crushed the nose inward. They were dead, held in their seats by their harnesses. But as Caleb moved back into the main passenger cabin, the puzzle pieces stopped fitting together. There were 4 dead men strapped into the seats. Caleb checked their pulses out of protocol, but their bodies were already rigid. He shined his light on their faces and their gear. They weren't civilians. They were wearing sterile, unmarked tactical gear. No dog tags. No identifying patches. "Chief, look at this," Sullivan said, his voice trembling slightly. He was pointing at the bulkhead near the emergency exit. Caleb walked over. Clustered around the doorframe were a dozen jagged holes. Caleb ran his gloved finger over the torn metal. They were punched from the outside in. "Bullet holes," Caleb breathed. 5. 56 millimeter by the look of it. Grouped tight. "Someone shot at the plane?" Sullivan asked, confusion lacing his words. "While it was crashing?" "No," Caleb said, his mind racing, piecing together the grim timeline. The plane was on the ground. It crash-landed. They survived the crash. Caleb pointed to the dead men in the seats. "Look at their wounds. They didn't die from blunt force trauma. They died from high-velocity gunshot wounds to the chest and head. They were executed in their seats." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced through Caleb's exhaustion. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a crime scene. And if Caldwell had been on this plane, his body wasn't here. Caleb turned around, looking out the torn fuselage into the howling white abyss of the storm. The wind screamed past the jagged metal. He crouched down next to his radio man, the realization of their vulnerability settling heavily upon him. He looked at the blood, the bullet holes, and the endless, blinding snow outside. "Are they still alive?" The Navy SEAL whispered in the middle of the storm, his words meant for Caldwell and whoever had taken him. Right at that moment, Kaiser lunged forward toward the open doorway, barking viciously into the whiteout. "Movement!" Finnegan's voice cracked over the radio, laced with panic. "Chief, I've got thermals. Multiple heat signatures converging on your position from the east. They're moving fast, tactical spacing. They're closing in on the wreck. Contact right. Finn, lay down suppressing fire." Caleb roared, instinctively shoving Sullivan to the deck of the fuselage as the sharp supersonic crack of incoming rounds echoed over the storm's roar. Sparks showered the cabin as bullets tore through the aluminum hull inches above their heads. The assailants were using suppressed weapons, the sound dampened by the blizzard. But the deadly impact of the rounds was unmistakable. From the ridge above, Finnegan's MK-48 opened up. The deep, rhythmic thud of the heavy machine gun provided a momentary blanket of sound and lead. Tracers cut through the snow, illuminating the blinding white with streaks of red fire. "I can barely see them, Chief," Finnegan yelled over the comms. "Their thermal signatures are weak. They're wearing insulated cloaks or thermal dampeners. Ghost targets. Sully, can you move?" Caleb asked, grabbing the medic by the shoulder harness of his vest. Yeah, I'm good," Sullivan grunted, though his face was pale, and his breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. "We are sitting ducks in this metal tube. We need hard cover," Caleb said, his mind processing tactical variables at light speed. There was a glacial crevasse 50 yards back. "The way we came. We fall back to that trench. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Move." Caleb threw a smoke grenade out the torn fuselage. It was a futile gesture in 90-knot winds. The gray smoke was instantly violently dispersed, but it offered a psychological second of cover. Caleb, Sullivan, and Kaiser bolted from the wreckage, plunging back into the knee-deep snow. The air around them snapped and hissed. A round struck a boulder next to Caleb's head, showering his visor with rock splinters. Kaiser ran tightly at Caleb's hip, his head low, unfazed by the gunfire, wholly focused on his handler. They scrambled up the snowy embankment, slipping and sliding. Sullivan cried out as his bad ankle gave way, sending him sprawling into the drift. "Man down!" Caleb shouted, spinning around. He laid down a burst of suppressive fire with his MK-18 into the blinding storm, aiming blindly in the direction of the incoming rounds. Kaiser didn't wait for a command. The dog bounded back to Sullivan, grabbing the heavy drag handle on the back of the medic's tactical vest with his powerful jaws. With a tremendous heave, the German shepherd anchored his paws and pulled backward, dragging the fully equipped, 200-pound man a crucial few feet toward cover. Caleb grabbed Sullivan's shoulder and hoisted him up. "Come on, Sully. Push." They crested the small ridge and slid down into the crevasse. It was a narrow, icy fissure in the rock, about 6 feet deep. It offered solid protection from the lateral gunfire and shielded them from the worst of the biting wind. A second later, Finnegan slid down the ice wall, crashing into them. "They're flanking us," Finnegan panted, checking his ammo box. "At least a dozen of them. Organized. Professional. They bounded forward under my fire. They aren't scared. They're a recovery team," Caleb deduced, wiping the freezing sweat from his brow. "They shot down the plane, came in to extract Caldwell, executed the security detail, and now we just walked into their mop-up operation." "Chief." Sullivan's voice was weak. He was leaning heavily against the ice wall. Caleb looked over. Sullivan was clutching his left side. Blood, dark and steaming in the frigid air, was oozing rapidly between his gloved fingers. He hadn't just tripped, he'd been hit during the retreat. "Damn it," Caleb swore softly, instantly switching from squad leader to trauma medic. "Finn, watch the lip of the crevasse. If anything moves, kill it." Caleb ripped open Sullivan's vest, exposing his cold weather layers. The bullet had caught him just below the armpit, slipping past the ceramic armor plate. It was a through and through, but it was bleeding heavily. Caleb quickly packed the wound with combat gauze, pressing down hard. Sullivan let out a muffled scream, biting down on the collar of his jacket. "Hold on, buddy. I got you," Caleb reassured him, applying a chest seal to prevent a collapsed lung. Kaiser whined softly, nudging Sullivan's face with a cold nose, offering the only comfort he could. "Chief, we have a major problem," Finnegan whispered. He was peering over the edge of the ice, using a small thermal periscope. "They've stopped advancing. They're setting up a perimeter around this crevasse. They know we're trapped." Caleb finished taping Sullivan's bandages. He checked his satellite radio again. Still dead. No comms, no backup, no air support. The storm was projected to last for another 12 hours. Sullivan would bleed out or freeze to death long before then. "Why aren't they rushing us?" Finnegan asked. "They have the numbers, because they don't have to," Caleb said grimly, looking up at the sky, which was darkening from a violent gray to pitch black. "They know the cold will kill us for them. They're just making sure we can't crawl out." The temperature was still dropping. Caleb could feel the deep, biting cold seeping through his boots and his gloves. The moisture in his lungs felt like glass shards with every breath. Kaiser suddenly stood rigid, his head tilting toward the narrow, dark end of the crevasse that snaked deeper into the rocky island. The dog let out a sharp, single bark and took 3 aggressive steps into the darkness, his hackles fully raised. "Finn," Caleb whispered, raising his rifle and pointing it down the icy tunnel. "Tell me, this crevasse is a dead end." "Map data was sketchy," Finnegan replied, his weapon tracking Kaiser's line of sight. "But I don't think it is." From the black depths of the ice cave, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed over the howling wind. It wasn't the sound of the storm. It was the distinct crunch of heavy boots on packed ice. Someone or something was coming up behind them. The crunch of boots on the packed ice echoed off the narrow, claustrophobic walls of the crevasse. The sound was agonizingly slow, deliberate, and moving closer. Caleb Hayes didn't breathe. He smoothly transitioned his MK-18 to his left shoulder, slicing the pie around the jagged ice corner, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. Behind him, Finnegan kept his heavy Mk-48 trained on the lip of the ravine, watching for the heavily armed hunters above. Sullivan was fading fast, his breathing a wet, rattling wheeze. Kaiser stood at Caleb's knee. The German shepherd's ears were pinned back, his jaw slightly open, exposing razor-sharp canines. He didn't bark again. He knew the difference between an alert and an ambush. The dog was a coiled spring of muscle and lethal intent, waiting for the single German command fast to launch himself into the dark. A shadow detached itself from the absolute blackness of the ice tunnel. Caleb activated his surefire weapon light, pinning the figure against the frozen wall in a blinding circle of white luminescence. "Drop it! Hands where I can see them," Caleb ordered, his voice a harsh, controlled rasp. The figure flinched, throwing a hand over their eyes. It wasn't one of the thermal-cloaked hunters. It was a man, shivering violently, covered in a thick layer of frost and frozen blood. He was clutching a customized SIG MCX rifle, but the weapon was hanging loosely by its two-point sling. He wore a ripped, civilian-style Arc'teryx tactical jacket, its Gore-Tex shell slashed open at the shoulder. "Don't shoot." "American. I'm American," the man stammered, his teeth chattering so hard the words barely formed. He slowly raised his empty hands, letting the rifle dangle against his chest. Caleb kept the light in the man's eyes but lowered the muzzle of his rifle slightly. "Identify yourself." Jonathan Cole, Constellus Security." The man gasped for air, leaning his back against the ice. "I was the detail lead. For the package." The man gasped. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Constellus was a massive private military contractor, the corporate descendant of Blackwater. If Caldwell had top-tier private security, whoever hit them was operating on a terrifying level of capability. "Where is Dr. Caldwell?" Caleb demanded, stepping closer. He signaled Kaiser with a subtle hand gesture, "Bleeb," and the dog sat instantly, though his eyes never left the newcomer. "Taken." Cole wheezed, sliding down the ice wall until he was sitting on the frozen floor. "They didn't want to kill him. They EMP'd the plane, fried the avionics, forced a hard landing. We survived the crash. Mostly. But they were waiting. Like they knew exactly where we'd drop." "Who is they?" Finnegan asked, glancing over his shoulder. Cole looked up, his eyes wide with a residual terror that transcended the freezing cold. Not regular military, no insignias. Spoke Russian, but their gear was NATO spec, suppressed HK-416S, panoramic night vision. They slaughtered my men in their seats before we could even unbuckle. I got pushed out the emergency exit when the fuselage tore open. Fell into this fissure. "How long ago?" Caleb asked, kneeling beside Sullivan to check the chest seal. The medic was unconscious now, his skin the color of old parchment. 30 minutes. Maybe an hour. I don't know. Time is gone, Cole muttered. They dragged Caldwell up the ridge. They have a staging area, an old Cold War listening post about 2 miles east of here. I heard them talking about an extraction sub, a Kilo-class submarine pushing through the pack ice. A submarine. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a rogue cell. This was a state-sponsored black operation. If they got Caldwell onto a Russian sub, the US would lose decades of advanced autonomous warfare research, and the geopolitical fallout would be catastrophic. Suddenly, a metallic clink echoed from the lip of the crevasse above them. Kaiser's head snapped upward. Grenade, Finnegan roared. A small, cylindrical object bounced off the icy lip and plummeted toward them. It wasn't a standard fragmentation grenade. It was a flashed bang, meant to blind and deafen them before the assault team breached the trench. "Cover!" Caleb shouted, grabbing Sullivan by the tactical harness and dragging him violently into the dark mouth of the tunnel where Cole had emerged. Finnegan dove in right behind them, tackling Cole to the ground. The detonation was deafening in the confined space. The shockwave rattled Caleb's teeth and sent a shower of razor-sharp ice shards raining down on them. A blinding flash of white light momentarily burned through their night vision. "They're pushing!" Finnegan yelled, scrambling to his knees and blindly firing a long, deafening burst from his MK-48 toward the entrance of the tunnel. The heavy 7.62mm rounds chewed into the ice, creating a cloud of pulverized snow and rock. "Move! Deeper into the ice," Caleb ordered. He hoisted Sullivan onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry, ignoring the burning strain in his own back. "Cole, if you can walk, you take point." "Kaiser, Voron," the dog darted ahead of Cole, his keen night vision and superior senses mapping the pitch-black, treacherous terrain of the subterranean ice cave. The hunters above had breached the crevasse. Caleb could hear the crunch of their boots and the sharp, clipped commands spoken in Russian echoing behind them. The hunt had moved underground. The ice tunnel was a geographical nightmare. Carved by thousands of years of glacial meltwater, it twisted and turned, dropping sharply in elevation. The air inside was dead and unimaginably cold, smelling faintly of ancient dust and copper, the scent of Sullivan's blood trailing behind them. Caleb's muscles screamed in protest under the dead weight of his wounded medic. Finnegan walked backward, his heavy machine gun trained on the dark corridor they were leaving behind, covering their retreat. Cole was stumbling ahead, relying entirely on Kaiser to navigate the treacherous, uneven floor. "How far does this go, Cole?" Caleb grunted, his breath pluming like dragon smoke in the pale beam of his headlamp. "I don't know," Cole panted, his voice echoing eerily. "I crawled in here to hide. I saw a draft. Airflow. It has to connect to the surface, maybe near the radar station. It better." Finnegan muttered. "Because I've got 2 thermals on my scope. They're tracking our blood trail. They're about 50 yards back, and closing fast." Caleb assessed their grim reality. They were outgunned, carrying a critically wounded man, and trapped in a bottleneck. If the Russian operatives caught them in this narrow corridor, it would be a slaughter. They needed a choke point. They needed to turn the hunters into the hunted. "Finn," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "We're going to set an ambush. In here?" "It's a shooting gallery, Chief." "Exactly. We use it," Caleb replied. He looked around. Just ahead, the tunnel widened slightly into a small domed cavern, before narrowing again into a tight fissure. Giant icicles hung from the ceiling like Damocles' swords. "Cole, help me get Sully down behind that ice pillar," Caleb ordered. Together, they lowered the unconscious medic into the shadows. Caleb checked his pulse. It was incredibly weak. Threading away, Caleb pulled a block of C4 explosive from his tactical pouch. It was malleable, even in the freezing cold. He molded it quickly, pressing it into a deep crack in the load-bearing ice wall near the cavern's entrance, right beneath a massive cluster of hanging ice spikes. He pushed a remote detonator into the gray clay. "Finn, set up on the far side of the cavern. Suppressed fire only." "We don't want to bring the whole roof down on our own heads," Caleb instructed. He then turned to his most lethal weapon. Kaiser was sitting patiently, his golden eyes glowing in the ambient light. Caleb knelt in front of the dog, pressing his forehead against Kaiser's snout. "Listen to me, buddy," Caleb whispered. "We need a ghost." He unclipped the heavy Kevlar leash. He reached down and clicked a small toggle on Kaiser's collar, activating the silent, vibrating receiver. Caleb pointed to a dark alcove carved into the ice, high up on the flank of the tunnel entrance. "Kaiser, versteck dich." Hede, the 100-pound dog, leaped with terrifying grace, scrambling up the slick ice using his specialized booties for traction, and vanished into the pitch-black alcove. He made absolutely no sound. Caleb extinguished his light, plunging the cavern into total darkness. He pulled his panoramic night vision goggles down over his eyes. The world shifted back to the grainy, ghostly green. He took his position behind a jagged rock outcropping, directly across from Finnegan. The silence was profound, broken only by the dripping of water and Sullivan's labored breathing. Then, they heard it. The soft, synchronized crunch, crunch, crunch of tactical boots approaching. Through his NODs, Caleb saw 2 figures enter the cavern. They were professionals. They moved with fluid, lethal efficiency. Their weapons, at the low, ready. They were wearing advanced thermal cloaking ponchos, making them look like indistinct, shimmering gray blobs in the night vision. But their thermal optic goggles glowed with a faint, telltale heat signature. One of the operatives knelt down, touching a drop of Sullivan's frozen blood on the floor. He signaled to his partner, pointing directly toward the ice pillar where Caleb and the others were hiding. They knew. The operative raised his suppressed rifle. Caleb didn't hesitate. He squeezed the clacker in his left hand. The C4 detonated with a sharp, concussive crack, rather than a fiery boom. The precise explosive charge shattered the load-bearing ice wall. Above the two Russian operatives, the ceiling groaned violently. A massive, jagged chunk of ice weighing hundreds of pounds sheared off and plummeted downward. It struck the trailing operative squarely on the shoulder, driving him to the ground with a sickening crunch of bone. He let out a muffled scream. The lead operative reacted instantly, rolling away from the falling debris and snapping his rifle toward Caleb's position, firing a rapid trio of suppressed rounds that chipped the ice inches from Caleb's face. Before Caleb could return fire, a massive black shadow launched itself from the ceiling alcove. Kaiser descended like an avenging angel. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. The Navy SEAL dog hit the lead operative squarely in the chest, with all 100 pounds of his kinetic mass. The man was thrown violently backward, his rifle clattering across the ice. Before the operative could even process the attack, Kaiser's jaws clamped down with bone-crushing force onto the man's gun arm, right at the wrist. The operative screamed in agony, thrashing wildly, pulling a combat knife with his free hand. "Kaiser! Higher!" Caleb shouted, stepping out from cover. Kaiser instantly released the arm, springing backward out of the line of fire. Caleb raised his MK-18 and fired 2 rounds in rapid succession. The heavy, suppressed 5.56mm bullets found their mark, neutralizing the operative instantly. Finnegan moved up, keeping his weapon trained on the man pinned under the ice block. The operative was struggling weakly, reaching for his sidearm. Finnegan kicked the gun away and neutralized the threat. The cavern fell silent once more. The ambush had taken less than 10 seconds. "Good boy," Caleb breathed, rubbing Kaiser's ears. The dog licked blood from his chops, his tail wagging once, awaiting the next command. "Chief, we need to go," Cole said, his voice trembling as he looked at the dead men. "If they haven't checked in, the rest of the team at the radar station will come looking." Caleb walked over to the dead operative and stripped off his thermal optic goggles and a spare magazine, tossing them to Cole. "Then we don't keep them waiting." They hoisted Sullivan up once more and pushed forward through the narrow fissure at the back of the cavern. The air grew steadily colder, but the suffocating darkness began to lift. A faint, bruised purple light was filtering through the ice ahead. They broke through the surface 10 minutes later, emerging from a snow-choked cave mouth into the howling fury of the blizzard. The wind immediately sapped the warmth from their bodies, but through the swirling whiteout, Caleb saw it. Less than 300 yards away, sitting on a jagged promontory overlooking the churning Bering Sea, was a massive, rusted dome, the abandoned Cold War radar station, and surrounding it were the distinct, angular shapes of 3 modern tactical snowcats, heavily armed men patrolling the perimeter, and a thick, armored cable running from a massive diesel generator into the bunker beneath the dome. Dr. Arthur Caldwell was inside, but SEAL Team 6's Alpha Squad, battered, bleeding, and freezing to death, had just walked into the lion's den. "Are they still alive?" Caleb whispered to himself, feeling the freezing wind bite his face. He looked at Kaiser, who was staring intently at the bunker, a low growl starting deep in his chest. It was time to find out. The abandoned Cold War radar station loomed out of the whiteout like a rusted metallic skull, originally built in the 1960s to monitor Soviet airspace. The geodesic dome had been battered by decades of relentless Arctic storms. Now, it was a fortified staging ground. Through the lens of his thermal optics, Chief Petty Officer Caleb Hayes analyzed the perimeter. The enemy had established a textbook defensive posture. 2 snowcats were parked near the heavy steel blast doors at the base of the dome, their engines idling to keep the block heaters from freezing, pumping thick plumes of diesel exhaust into the blizzard. 4 sentries patrolled the exterior, walking in overlapping pairs. They were heavily armed, wearing advanced whiteout camouflage and thermal dampening gear. They're dug in deep, Finnegan whispered over the localized comms, his voice a harsh rasp. And we are running on fumes. We can't take Sully in there, Caleb said, his eyes scanning the frozen terrain. He pointed to a dilapidated, half-buried cinderblock generator shed about 50 yards from their position, outside the main patrol route. We stash him there, patch him up as best we can. Once we secure Caldwell, we come back for him. Jonathan Cole, the surviving Constellus contractor, looked horrified. You're going to leave him? In this temperature, his core heat will drop to fatal levels in 20 minutes. It's either that or he dies in a crossfire in the next 3, Caleb countered, his tone leaving no room for debate. Grab his other shoulder. Move. They leopard crawled through the waist-deep snow, using the howling wind to mask the sound of their approach. Kaiser crawled right beside Caleb, his belly dragging against the ice, his ears pinned back against his skull. The dog understood stealth. He moved like a shadow detached from the night. They reached the rusted door of the shed. Caleb popped the frozen hinges with the blade of his combat knife. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled of ancient oil and decaying concrete, but it was out of the wind. Caleb laid Sullivan on the frozen floor. The medic's skin was ice cold, his breathing dangerously shallow. Caleb pulled a specialized mylar thermal blanket from his pack, wrapping it tightly around Sullivan to reflect his failing body heat back inward. He then administered a second dose of morphine and a shot of epinephrine to keep the medic's heart pumping. Hold the line, Sully, Caleb whispered, gripping the unconscious man's shoulder. I'll be back for you. That's a promise. Caleb turned to Cole. You stay here, watch the door. If anyone comes through that isn't us, you put them down. Cole shook his head, gripping his scavenged rifle tightly. No. Caldwell was my package. My men died on that plane. I'm going in with you. Caleb studied the contractor for a long second. He saw the terror in Cole's eyes, but beneath it, a desperate, hardening resolve. Caleb gave a curt nod. Check your safety. Do exactly as I say. Finn, you're on the heavy gun. Suppressive fire only if we are compromised. We need a quiet breach. They left the shed, melting back into the storm. The wind was whipping snow into their faces with the force of sandblasting equipment. They approached the rear of the dome, targeting a heavily iced-over ventilation shaft Caleb had spotted on the satellite schematics during the briefing on the USS Anchorage. 2 sentries rounding the far side. Finnegan hissed, tracking the heat signatures. Kaiser, Caleb murmured, unhooking the dog's leash. He pointed to a cluster of rusted fuel barrels near the sentry's path. Voren. Lot. Go. Speak. Kaiser darted through the snow, a phantom in the blizzard. He reached the barrels, hidden from the sentry's direct line of sight. Suddenly, a vicious, deep-throated bark echoed through the storm, sounding like a massive, rabid wolf. The 2 sentries instantly stopped, raising their suppressed rifles and pivoting their night vision goggles toward the sound. What the hell was that? One of them yelled over the wind. They broke formation, stepping away from the dome to investigate the noise. It was the opening Caleb needed. Move, Caleb commanded. He, Finnegan, and Cole sprinted across the open ice to the base of the ventilation shaft. The heavy steel grate was secured by 4 massive bolts, rusted solid by the salt air. Caleb pulled a thermal breaching pen from his vest. He ignited it, the localized plasma flame burning at over 4,000 degrees. He sliced through the heavy iron bolts in seconds, the molten slag hissing violently as it hit the snow. Finnegan caught the heavy grate before it could clang against the concrete and carefully set it aside. Go, go. Caleb pushed Cole into the dark, narrow shaft, followed by Finnegan. Caleb turned back toward the snowdrifts. Kaiser! Higher! A shadow broke from the whiteout. Kaiser bounded across the ice, leaping effortlessly into the 3-foot-high ventilation shaft, just as the sentries began walking back toward their post, confused by the vanishing sound. Caleb slid in last, pulling the heavy grate back into place to conceal their entry. They were inside the Devil's Anvil. The shaft dropped vertically after 10 feet. They used an old maintenance ladder, descending into the pitch-black bowels of the bunker. The temperature rose slightly, but the air was stale and carried the distinct, metallic scent of ozone and gun oil. Caleb hit the deck of the sub-level silently, his weapon raised. Through his night vision, the concrete corridors looked like a labyrinth of green ghosts. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the cracked linoleum floor. "Comms check," Caleb whispered. Nothing but static. They were too deep under the reinforced concrete and steel dome. They were completely cut off from the outside world. Suddenly, the low hum of a massive diesel engine vibrated through the floorboards, flickering. Low-wattage emergency lights buzzed to life overhead, casting long, menacing shadows down the corridor. "They just fired up the main auxiliary power," Finnegan muttered, checking his MK-48. From a room down the hall, Caleb heard voices. They weren't speaking Russian anymore. They were speaking English, sharp and precise. Caleb crept forward, Kaiser glued to his thigh. He peered around the edge of a heavy steel blast door that had been wedged open. Inside what used to be the station's primary telemetry control room, banks of ancient computer mainframes had been ripped out to make room for modern, sleek server racks. In the center of the room, strapped to a heavy metal chair, was Dr. Arthur Caldwell. His face was battered, his glasses shattered, and his lip was bleeding profusely. Standing over him was a man in a pristine, dark tactical uniform. He had silver hair and a sharp, aristocratic face. He held a customized tablet in one hand and a heavy, suppressed pistol in the other. "I will ask you one final time, Doctor," the silver-haired man said, his accent British, his tone chillingly calm. "The EMP burst on your aircraft, fried the biometric decryption key. The submarine extraction is delayed by 12 hours due to this infernal weather. We cannot wait. I need the manual override password for the DARPA drive. Now, go to hell, Sterling," Caldwell spat, coughing up blood. "You give them that code. You hand them the keys to every autonomous drone in the NATO fleet. They'll turn our own weapons against our cities." Sterling sighed, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Caldwell's kneecap. "Patriotism is such a tedious flaw, Doctor. We are mercenaries. We don't care about cities. We care about the wire transfer. Code. Now." Caleb tightened his grip on his rifle. The clock had run out. Caleb held up a clenched fist. "Hold." Finnegan and Cole froze behind him in the shadowed corridor. Kaiser stood perfectly still, a low, barely audible vibration of a growl humming deep in his chest. Caleb quickly assessed the room through the crack in the blast door. Sterling was the primary threat, standing over Caldwell. But there were 4 other heavily armed contractors in the room. 2 were manning the server racks, furiously typing on ruggedized laptops, trying to brute force the DARPA drive. 2 more stood guard by a secondary exit at the far end of the room, holding short-barreled assault rifles at the low ready. 5 tangos, Caleb whispered, flashing hand signals to his team. "Finn, take the 2 on the servers. Cole, you take the 2 by the door. I've got Sterling. On my mark, we breach hard and fast. Kaiser, fast." Caleb unhooked a flashbang from his chest rig, pulled the pin, and held the spoon tight. He took a deep, steadying breath, letting the adrenaline sharpen his focus into a razor's edge. "Mark." Caleb hurled the flashbang into the center of the room and instantly squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head. Bang! The concussive blast shattered the fluorescent lights overhead and filled the room with a blinding white strobe and a deafening roar. Before the smoke even began to clear, SEAL Team 6 breached. Caleb pivoted through the doorway, his MK-18 locked onto his shoulder. Sterling, disoriented by the blast, had stumbled backward away from Caldwell, raising an arm to shield his eyes. Caleb fired twice. The suppressed rounds cracked through the air. One caught Sterling in the right shoulder, spinning him around. The second shattered the tablet in his hand. Simultaneously, the thunderous roar of Finnegan's MK-48 machine gun filled the confined space. He didn't bother with precision. He laid down a wall of 7, 62mm lead that shredded the server racks and the 2 technicians standing in front of them. Sparks showered the room as the expensive electronics exploded. By the far door, the remaining 2 guards had recovered from the flashbang faster than anticipated. One of them raised his rifle, acquiring Cole in his sights. Cole froze, his finger locking up on his trigger. The trauma of the plane crash and the sheer violence of the breach paralyzed him for a crucial microsecond. "Gun!" Caleb roared, but Kaiser was already there. The German shepherd had launched himself through the door the millisecond the flashbang detonated. He crossed the 20 feet of the control room in a blur of black and tan fur. As the guard aimed at Cole, Kaiser struck him chest high. The sheer kinetic force of the 100-pound dog hitting a stationary target threw the guard violently against the concrete wall. Kaiser's jaws locked onto the man's throat, neutralizing the threat instantly. The second guard panicked, swinging his weapon toward the dog. Cole snapped out of his trance. He raised his scavenged rifle and fired a rapid 3-round burst, hitting the guard square in the chest plate. The man staggered backward and collapsed. The room fell deadly silent, save for the ringing in their ears and the sparking of the destroyed servers. "Clear!" Finnegan yelled, doing a rapid sweep of the corners. "Clear!" Cole echoed, his voice shaking badly. Caleb rushed to Caldwell. The scientist was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with shock. Caleb quickly cut the heavy zip ties binding his wrists and ankles with his combat knife. "Dr. Caldwell?" "Chief Hayes, U.S. Navy," Caleb said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're getting you out of here." Caldwell grabbed Caleb's tactical vest, his hands trembling violently. "The drive! The data!" Caleb looked over at the shattered server racks. "My heavy gunner just turned it into Swiss cheese, Doctor. The data is gone." "No," Caldwell yelled, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at Sterling, who was slumped against the wall, bleeding heavily from his shattered shoulder, a dark laugh bubbling on his lips. "They weren't downloading it here. They were using the radar dome's massive telemetry array to broadcast the encrypted file directly to a Russian satellite. The decryption key was just to speed up the process. If the file finishes transmitting, they can crack it on their own mainframes in Moscow." Caleb's blood ran cold. He spun toward Sterling, leveling his rifle at the mercenary's head. "How long?" Sterling coughed, blood staining his white teeth. "You're too late, Chief. The upload is at 98%. The dome's transmitter is hardwired to the main generator outside. You can't stop it from in here." "Finn, can we cut the hard lines?" Caleb demanded, looking at the tangled mess of thick black cables running up through the ceiling toward the dome. "No good, Chief," Finnegan said, inspecting the cables. "They're shielded in titanium conduit. I'd need a blowtorch." "The generator," Cole said, his face pale. "The main diesel generator outside the blast doors. If we destroy that, the transmitter loses power. The upload fails." Caleb looked at his wrist-mounted tactical display. The upload progress bar on Sterling's shattered but still miraculously functioning tablet screen blinked ominously. 98.5%. "We have less than 2 minutes," Caleb said grimly. "Finn, you and Cole stay here. Secure the package. Watch the doors. The rest of the garrison is going to collapse on this room any second. Chief, you can't go back out there alone," Finnegan argued, stepping forward. "There are at least a dozen heavily armed men between here and that generator." "I'm not alone," Caleb said, looking down. Kaiser was sitting at attention, his fur matted with blood that wasn't his own. His golden eyes locked on Caleb. The dog gave a single, sharp woof. "Hold the line," Caleb ordered. He turned and sprinted back the way they came, heading for the claustrophobic darkness of the ventilation shaft. The fate of global security now relied on a bleeding Navy SEAL and a dog, running headfirst back into the fury of the Arctic storm. The ventilation shaft felt like a tomb, constricting around Caleb's broad shoulders as he forced himself backward toward the surface. His lungs burned, the freezing air searing his trachea with every rapid breath. Ahead of him, Kaiser moved with terrifying urgency, his sharp claws scraping against the rusted iron grating. The dog knew the stakes. They shared a bond forged in the bloody dust of Helmand Province and the suffocating jungles of Colombia. Kaiser didn't need words to sense the desperate acceleration of his handler's heartbeat. They reached the exterior grate. Caleb shoved it aside, and the Bering Sea blizzard instantly punished them, hitting them with a wall of white kinetic fury. The temperature had dropped further, the wind chill pushing 50 below zero. Exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 3 minutes. Caleb pulled himself out of the snowdrift, immediately bringing his Mk-18 to bear. The geodesic dome was 50 yards behind him. Directly ahead, illuminating the swirling snow with harsh, yellowish halogen work lights, was the objective. A massive, industrial Caterpillar C-32 diesel generator, housed in a reinforced steel cage. Thick, armored power conduits snaked from its alternator directly into the concrete foundation of the dome, feeding the telemetry dish above. Guarding it were 6 men. Through the green haze of his GPNVG 1.8 panoramic night vision, Caleb analyzed the opposition. These weren't Constellus contractors or standard Russian infantry. They wore bulky, top-tier winter combat gear, armed with suppressed AK-12 assault rifles and carrying heavy fragmentation grenades. One of them, a giant of a man standing near the generator's exhaust stack, held a PKP Pecheneg general-purpose machine gun. They were Zaslon, the ultra-secretive, highly lethal kinetic operations branch of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR. Caleb checked his wrist display. The synchronized timer he had started the moment Sterling mentioned the upload sat at 65 seconds. He didn't have time for a tactical, methodical takedown. He had to use shock and awe. Kaiser. Caleb whispered over the howling wind, unclipping a flashbang from his chest rig. He pointed to the left flank, where 2 Zaslon operatives were huddled near the tracks of a snowcat. Flank, FAS, flank, attack. The German Shepherd vanished into the whiteout, a silent missile banking left. Caleb began his sprint straight up the middle, his boots finding traction on the hard-packed ice. He pulled the pin on the flashbang and hurled it toward the center of the formation, right at the feet of the heavy gunner. The grenade detonated with a blinding, concussive flash that briefly turned the blizzard into a wall of pure, magnesium white light. Before the sound of the explosion even faded, Kaiser struck. The dog leaped from the top of the snowcat's treads, clearing 10 feet of air, and slammed into the chest of the operative on the far left. The man's scream was instantly cut off as Kaiser's jaws found the thick collar of his tactical jacket, violently dragging him down into the snow and neutralizing him in a flurry of thrashing limbs and ice. Caleb opened fire. Sprinting full tilt, he fired controlled double taps. The suppressed 5.56 millimeters rounds hammered into the 2 guards on the right flank. One took a round through his ballistic visor, dropping instantly. The second managed to raise his AK-12, firing a wild burst into the dark. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded in Caleb's left thigh. A 5.45 millimeters round grazed his leg, tearing through the Gore-Tex and slicing his muscle. He stumbled, his knee hitting the ice hard, but he kept his weapon raised, neutralizing the shooter with a clean shot to the chest plate that drove the breath from the man's lungs and put him on his back. 40 seconds. The heavy gunner, recovering from the flashbang, roared in Russian and swung the massive Pecheneg machine gun toward Caleb. A terrifying stream of heavy 7.62 x5 4mm tracer rounds tore through the night, chewing up the ice and shattering the windshield of the nearby snowcat. Caleb dove behind a rusted steel storage crate as the heavy rounds sparked and pinged against the metal, threatening to tear right through it. He was pinned. He couldn't reach the generator. "Kaiser! Higher!" Caleb screamed. The dog abandoned the downed operative and sprinted through the hail of gunfire, diving behind the crate and slamming into Caleb's side, panting heavily. 30 seconds. If the upload finished, the DARPA autonomous drone architecture would belong to Moscow. Caleb reached into his pouch and pulled out his last block of C4. He shoved a radio frequency detonator deep into the gray explosive clay. He couldn't throw it far enough to guarantee disabling the armored generator block, and he couldn't run through the Pecheneg's line of fire. He looked at his dog. Kaiser stared back, his ears perked, utterly fearless. "I'm sorry, buddy," Caleb whispered, his heart breaking. He took the heavy nylon drag handle of Kaiser's tactical vest and firmly shoved the block of C4 into the deep utility pouch on the dog's ribcage. "Kaiser, look at me." Caleb grabbed the dog's snout, forcing eye contact. He pointed directly at the roaring diesel generator. "Foreign. Bleeb. Go. Stay." Kaiser didn't hesitate. He didn't cower. The Navy SEAL dog bolted from behind the crate, sprinting incredibly low to the ground. The heavy gunner saw the movement and shifted his fire, trailing the dog. The ice exploded in geysers all around Kaiser. A round grazed the dog's armored vest, spinning him slightly, but Kaiser recovered his footing instantly, his powerful legs driving him forward. Kaiser reached the steel cage of the generator, sliding under the massive exhaust pipe, entirely obscured from the gunner's line of sight. He sat down directly against the vibrating alternator block. Bleib. 15 seconds. Caleb broke from cover, raising his MK-18. He didn't aim for the gunner's body armor. He aimed for the exposed feed tray of the Pecheneg. He fired a sustained burst. Sparks flew as the 5.56mm rounds smashed into the weapon's receiver, jamming the belt and rendering the heavy machine gun useless. The Russian gunner threw the jammed weapon down and drew his sidearm, charging Caleb. Caleb dropped his empty rifle, drew his customized SIG P320 pistol, and fired 3 times. The operative fell backward into the snow. 10 seconds. Caleb stood alone in the howling wind, bleeding from his leg. He looked at the generator. He could see Kaiser's silhouette pressed against the machinery, waiting for his handler's next command. "Kaiser, higher, run!" Caleb screamed, his voice tearing. Kaiser bolted from the generator, sprinting back toward Caleb with everything he had. Caleb watched his tactical timer. 5, 4, 3. Kaiser was only halfway back. 2, 1. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut and crushed the detonator in his hand. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. The C4 ripped through the Caterpillar C-32 generator like a thunderbolt. A massive fireball of combusting diesel and shredded steel erupted into the black sky, momentarily turning the blizzard orange. The shockwave knocked Caleb off his feet, sending him sliding backward across the ice. Instantly, the heavy, vibrating hum of the dome's power grid ceased. The yellow halogen work lights died. The massive telemetry dish on top of the dome froze in its tracks. The upload was dead. Caleb scrambled to his knees, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine, desperately scanning the smoke and falling snow. "Kaiser! Kaiser!" Out of the black smoke, a shape materialized. Kaiser limped heavily toward him, his left front paw favoring the ice. His tactical vest singed and smoking, but his tail gave a weak, reassuring wag as he pushed his cold nose into Caleb's chest. Caleb wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the soot-stained fur. "Good boy," he choked out. "You're the best boy." But the victory was short-lived. A loud, metallic screech echoed from the dome. The heavy steel blast doors at the base of the structure were groaning open, pushed manually from the inside. Flashlight beams cut through the storm. The rest of the Russian garrison, furious and blind, was pouring out into the night. "Chief, do you read me?" "Chief." Finnegan's voice suddenly burst through the earpiece. The localized comms restored now that the dome's massive electromagnetic field had been killed. "I copy." "Finn." Caleb coughed, pulling himself to his feet and checking his pistol's magazine. "Generator is down. Upload stopped. But we have a battalion-sized problem walking out the front door." "We're already moving," Finnegan replied, his voice tight. "Cole and I have Caldwell. We went out the emergency fire exit on the sub-level. We're heading for your position. We need to grab Sully and exfil, now." "Negative on the exfil, Finn," Caleb said grimly, looking out at the frozen expanse of the Bering Sea. "Look at the ice. About 500 yards off the coast, the flat, frozen surface of the ocean was buckling. With a sound like a collapsing skyscraper, the ice shelf shattered upward. A massive, black, cylindrical monolith rose from the churning, freezing water. It was a Russian Kilo-class attack submarine, the Krasnodar. Water cascaded off its anechoic tiled hull. The extraction team wasn't just here to pick up Caldwell. They were here to wipe the island clean. On the deck of the submarine, armored hatches clanged open, and Caleb could see the terrifying silhouettes of deck-mounted heavy weapons spinning toward the shoreline. "We are officially out of time," Caleb whispered. "Move! Move!" Caleb roared, his voice tearing against the blizzard. He dragged his bleeding leg, limping frantically toward the dilapidated generator shed. Beside him, Kaiser moved in terrifying synchronization, favoring his left front paw, his tactical vest singed from the C4 blast. Behind them, the courtyard of the radar dome was a chaotic, strobe-lit hellscape. Finnegan's heavy MK-48 machine gun hammered a rhythmic, desperate beat from a rocky ridge, laying down a suppressing curtain of lead. Jonathan Cole, the lone surviving Constellus contractor, bodily shielded Dr. Arthur Caldwell, firing his scavenged rifle in tight bursts to hold back the surging tide of Russian mercenaries pouring from the bunker. Caleb hit the rusted door of the shed and practically fell inside the freezing darkness. Sully. He scrambled across the concrete until he found the crinkling mylar thermal blanket. Sullivan was unresponsive, his skin feeling like smooth ice. His pulse was a dying flutter. "Not today, kid," Caleb grunted, ignoring the searing agony in his grazed thigh. He hauled the 200-pound medic over his shoulders. He staggered outside just as Finnegan, Cole, and Caldwell slid down the icy embankment, diving behind the shed's thick concrete foundation. "Chief, they're flanking east," Finnegan yelled over the incoming fire. "We have zero room to maneuver. We're pinned against the cliff edge." Caldwell was weeping silently. Cole looked at Caleb, his eyes wide with the realization that they were going to die on this frozen rock. Then, Cole pointed a shaking finger toward the ocean. The sub, a mile out. The Russian Kilo-class submarine, Krasnodar, had fully surfaced. A brilliant white flare shot from its conning tower, illuminating the jagged coastline in a ghostly, skeletal glow. Then came the mechanical whine. The submarine's deck guns' twin-barreled 30mm autocannons were tracking their thermal signatures. "Get down!" Caleb screamed, throwing Sullivan to the ice and covering the medic with his own body. Kaiser instantly threw himself over Caleb's legs. Thump, 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 thump. The high-explosive shells walked up the beach, obliterating the ancient rocks and throwing massive geysers of ice and earth into the air. The barrage was walking straight toward their fragile concrete shield. 5 seconds, and they would be atomized. "Any station on this net. This is Alpha Actual. Broken arrow. I repeat, broken arrow." Caleb yelled blindly into his dead SATCOM radio, a desperate plea to an empty sky. The next salvo hit 20 yards away. The ground shook violently, stealing the hearing from their ears. Caleb braced for the end, his hand resting firmly on Kaiser's head. Suddenly, the night sky tore open. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of the atmosphere being violently ripped apart. A deafening, unearthly brrr vibrated the marrow in their bones. A massive beam of fiery light rained down from the heavens, completely bypassing the shed and striking the shoreline exactly where the Russian mercenaries were advancing. "What the hell is that?" Cole screamed. Caleb looked up, a feral grin breaking through the frost and blood on his face. "That is the United States Air Force. High above the blizzard, an AC-130J Ghost Rider gunship call sign. Spooky 43 banked in a lazy circle, scrambled from Elmendorf Air Force Base. The moment the unauthorized data transmission triggered NSA tripwires, the Ghost Rider unleashed hell. Its 25mm rotary cannon swept the coastline, obliterating the Russian ground forces. Then, the AC-130 shifted to the Krasnodar. It fired its 105mm howitzer. The massive shell shrieked downward, slamming into the water just 10 yards off the submarine's bow, throwing a freezing geyser 200 feet into the air. Dive, or die. The Russian commander didn't hesitate. The deck guns ceased. The Krasnodar blew its ballast tanks and initiated an emergency dive, retreating into the dark depths of the Bering Sea. "Alpha Actual, this is Spooky 43, a calm voice crackled over Caleb's headset. "We have splashed the hostiles and chased off the big fish. A 160th Soar bird is 3 mics out. Copy that, Spooky, Caleb breathed. God bless you. Minutes later, an MH-60 Black Hawk flared over the cliff edge. Pararescuemen leaped out, loading Sullivan onto a litter with oxygen and heated IVs. Cole helped Dr. Caldwell up the ramp. Finnegan collapsed into a jump seat. Caleb stood at the edge of the ramp. He turned back to Kaiser. The dog was sitting in the blood-stained snow, staring at the smoking ruins of the radar dome, ensuring the perimeter was secure. Kaiser, Caleb called softly. The German shepherd gave a sharp bark, trotted up the ramp, and shook the Arctic ice from his coat. As the Black Hawk ascended into the pale dawn, Kaiser curled up on the metal deck, resting his heavy head across Caleb's boots. The hum of the ICU at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was a stark contrast to the screaming winds of the Bering Sea. Sunlight cast warm stripes across the pristine linoleum. Chief Petty Officer Caleb Hayes sat in a plastic chair, his leg bandaged, a cane resting against his knee. In the bed beside him, Wyatt Sullivan slept, heavily medicated but stable. The doctors had saved his life, and miraculously, his arm. Dr. Caldwell was in a secure black site, debriefing the Pentagon on the DARPA tech that hadn't been stolen. The geopolitical chessboard had reset. Caleb reached down. Kaiser, wearing only a simple nylon collar, lay peacefully on the floor. The dog shifted, pressing his warm nose against Caleb's hand. Caleb scratched behind the shepherd's ears, tracing the raised scar from the bullet graze. The world would never know how close it came to the brink, nor the blood spilled on the ice to stop it. They didn't need to. We're still alive, the Navy SEAL whispered in the quiet room, and Kaiser softly whined in agreement.